The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Officer Derek Simmons adjusted his tie and leaned back in his seat with a smug grin. He sat at the prosecution's table, his polished uniform practically glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. Across the room, his blue eyes narrowed toward the defendant, a poised black woman seated at the defense table. The woman, Olivia Carter, sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her dark brown skin glowed under the sterile lights of the courtroom. Her fitted black blazer and crisp white shirt exuded calm professionalism. A thick braid of jet black hair trailed over her shoulder, and her dark eyes remained cold and composed as they met Simmons' mocking gaze. "You're going down for this one," Simmons whispered to the assistant district attorney sitting beside him. "I don't care what kind of connection she has. We've got enough evidence to bury her." The ADA, Malcolm Price, nodded confidently. "The judge is already leaning in our favor. All we need to do is push her a little." Olivia's attorney, David Reynolds, a seasoned defense lawyer with graying temples, leaned toward her. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected quiet tension. "They're confident," he whispered. "Too confident." "I know," Olivia replied softly. Her voice was low and even, betraying no hint of the storm brewing underneath. "Let them be." Judge Warren Blake entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him. The room settled into tense silence. Blake was a heavy-set man in his 60s with thinning white hair and a reputation for being strict but fair. He took his seat at the elevated bench, peering down at the room over his reading glasses. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Malcolm Price rose to deliver his opening statement. He approached the jury with measured confidence, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about obstruction of justice, plain and simple. Officer Simmons, a decorated member of this community, was in the process of conducting a lawful investigation when the defendant, Olivia Carter, interfered. Her actions were not only disruptive, but also aggressive. This is not a question of race or politics. This is about the rule of law." Olivia's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she maintained her calm exterior. Price's words were rehearsed, practiced, as though he had already secured the guilty verdict in his mind. Price continued, gesturing toward Olivia. "The evidence will show that Officer Simmons was forced to subdue Miss Carter after she verbally and physically resisted arrest. Officer Simmons did his job. He followed protocol. And yet, here we are, because Miss Carter believes she is above the law." Simmons smiled at the last line, leaning back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head as though he was watching a game he had already won. David Reynolds stood to make the defense's opening statement. He adjusted his glasses, taking his time as he stepped toward the jury. "The prosecution's story is compelling, but it's also false. The evidence will show that Officer Simmons used excessive force and escalated the situation without cause. Miss Carter did not resist. She asked a question, a simple, legal question, and for that, she was thrown to the ground and placed in handcuffs." Simmons' smile faltered. Reynolds' gaze sharpened. "And when you hear the full story, when you see the evidence, you'll understand that this is not just a case about obstruction. It's about abuse of power." Judge Blake nodded toward the prosecution. "Proceed with the first witness." Price called Officer Simmons to the stand. Simmons rose, fixing his tie and smoothing down the front of his uniform before stepping up to the witness stand. He took the oath, his right hand raised as he promised to tell the truth. Price paced in front of the jury. "Officer Simmons, can you describe the events that took place on the evening of June 12th? Simmons leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady and composed. "Yes, I was responding to a disturbance call near Fifth Avenue. I arrived to find Miss Carter standing near a restricted area. When I asked her to identify herself, she became aggressive and refused to comply. I gave her several verbal warnings, but she continued to argue. When I attempted to detain her, she resisted physically. At one point, she reached for my holster. Several members of the jury exchanged skeptical glances. Olivia's eyes darkened slightly. "Reach for your holster?" Price repeated. "Yes," Simmons said confidently. "I had no choice but to use force." David Reynolds leaned toward Olivia. This guy's good at lying. I know, Olivia murmured. Price smiled, stepping aside. No further questions, Your Honor. David Reynolds rose. Your Honor, I would like to cross-examine the witness. Judge Blake nodded. Proceed. Reynolds approached the stand, his tone sharp but polite. Officer Simmons, you stated that Miss Carter reached for your holster? Yes, Simmons said. Do you have any physical evidence to support that claim? Fingerprints on the holster? Witness testimony. Simmons hesitated for the briefest moment. It happened fast. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. Fast enough that it wasn't caught on your body camera? My camera was malfunctioning, Simmons replied quickly. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Convenient. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Reynolds smiled thinly. No further questions. Judge Blake glanced toward the defense table. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. As Simmons stepped down from the stand, he shot Olivia a victorious smile. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. Olivia's expression didn't change, but her hands curled slightly on the table. David sighed. They think they've already won. Let them think that, Olivia said calmly. Tomorrow, they'll see the truth. The next morning, Olivia Carter walked into the courtroom with measured steps, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something significant. Officer Simmons was already seated at the prosecution's table, chatting with Malcolm Price and laughing under his breath. His uniform was crisp, his posture relaxed, and his confident smile plastered across his face as he watched Olivia take her seat at the defense table. Morning, sweetheart, Simmons said, just loud enough for Olivia to hear. She didn't flinch. Her gaze remained calm and steady as she adjusted her blazer. David Reynolds, seated beside her, sighed. They're cocky this morning, he murmured. They should be, Olivia replied softly. It's the last time they'll feel this confident. Judge Blake entered the courtroom, and the chatter in the room immediately died down. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Price stood confidently, buttoning his jacket as he approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear from additional witnesses, people who were there when this incident occurred. Their testimonies will confirm what Officer Simmons has already told you, that Miss Carter was aggressive, threatening, and had to be subdued for the safety of everyone involved. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly, but her expression didn't waver. Price called the first witness, a young man named Jake Wilkins, a part-time security guard at the building where the incident had occurred. Jake walked to the stand, his nervous gaze darting towards Simmons, who nodded at him reassuringly. Price smiled. Mr. Wilkins, you were working at the property on the night in question, correct? Yes, sir, Jake replied. Did you see Ms. Carter interacting with Officer Simmons? Jake hesitated for a moment. Yes, I did. And what did you see? She was loud, Jake said carefully, his eyes shifting towards Simmons as though searching for approval. And aggressive. I remember hearing her shout at Officer Simmons. She wouldn't back down. David leaned toward Olivia. He's coached. I know, Olivia replied. And what happened next? Price pressed. She pushed him, Jake said quickly. And then I saw her try to grab his gun. Price nodded slowly, glancing toward the jury. No further questions, Your Honor. David stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold. Mr. Wilkins, he began, you work as a security guard at the property where this incident occurred? Yes, sir. And how long have you worked there? About 6 months. David nodded. And how long have you known Officer Simmons? Jake hesitated. I see him sometimes when he's on patrol. David's eyes sharpened. Would you describe your relationship as professional or personal? Professional, Jake said unconvincingly. David smiled faintly. And yet, you seem very confident about the details of this incident, despite the fact that you were standing over 50 feet away when it happened. Jake's face reddened. I saw what I saw. Really? David stepped closer. Because security footage shows that you were in the building lobby during the majority of the interaction. The footage we've obtained places you there until Officer Simmons called for backup. Would you like to explain that discrepancy? Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong, he stammered. David's gaze hardened. Or maybe you're remembering exactly what you were told to remember. Jake's face paled. He glanced towards Simmons, who sat stiffly at the prosecution's table. No further questions, David said coolly as he returned to his seat. Olivia's gaze flicked towards Simmons. His smile had faded, replaced by a slight crease in his brow. Next witness, Judge Blake instructed. Price called Officer Heather Mallory, Simmons' longtime partner. She walked confidently to the stand, her uniform immaculate, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Price smiled. Officer Mallory, you were present when Officer Simmons detained Miss Carter? Yes, I was, Mallory replied confidently. And what did you see? Mallory's gaze sharpened. Miss Carter was uncooperative from the moment Simmons approached her. She raised her voice, refused to comply, and physically resisted when Simmons attempted to restrain her. Did you see her reach for his weapon? Yes, Mallory said without hesitation. I saw her hand move toward his side. That's when Simmons had to take control of the situation. Price smiled at the jury. No further questions. David rose, his tone even sharper this time. Officer Mallory, how long have you worked with Officer Simmons? 5 years. And you've worked together on patrols? Yes. Would you say that you and Officer Simmons share a strong sense of trust? Of course. David's smile sharpened. Interesting, because Officer Simmons' body camera was malfunctioning that night. So is yours. Is that a coincidence? Mallory's eyes narrowed. Malfunctions happen. 2 malfunctions at the same time. David pressed. Mallory's jaw tightened. And when the backup arrived, David continued. You claim Miss Carter was still resisting, despite the fact that the backup officers reported that Miss Carter was already in cuffs when they arrived. Can you explain that? Mallory's mouth tightened. She was resisting before they arrived. David leaned closer. Or maybe you were helping cover for your partner's mistake. Mallory's mouth twisted into a scowl. No further questions, Your Honor. Mallory stepped down from the stand, her gaze flicking towards Simmons, who was no longer smiling. He sat rigid, his hands clasped together on the table. As the court adjourned for lunch, Simmons stood and approached Olivia as she was gathering her things. You think you're so smart? He whispered. You have no idea who you're up against. Olivia's eyes darkened. Slowly, she turned to face him, standing inches from his face. You don't either, she replied softly. Simmons' eyes narrowed. Careful, sweetheart. Olivia smiled faintly. Oh, I'm being very careful. After lunch, Olivia Carter walked back into the courtroom with the same measured composure. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, the sound reverberating through the silent chamber. Derek Simmons was already seated, his jaw set in a tight line, his once smug expression replaced by a thin layer of sweat glistening on his temple. David Reynolds leaned toward Olivia as they took their seats at the defense table. He's unraveling, David whispered. I know, Olivia replied, her voice calm. Her dark eyes were steady, like a predator closing in on wounded prey. Judge Blake entered the room, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the court. Let's proceed. Malcolm Price stood confidently. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Officer Derek Simmons back to the stand for further testimony. Simmons straightened his tie and stood, his mouth curling into a weak smile as he stepped up to the witness stand. He sat down, his posture stiff. Officer Simmons, Price began, you've testified that Miss Carter was resisting arrest and attempted to reach for your weapon. Do you stand by that statement? Yes, Simmons replied, his voice steady but lacking its earlier confidence. And the fact that your body camera malfunctioned, that was a coincidence. Yes, Simmons replied quickly. These things happen. Price nodded. Thank you, Officer Simmons. No further questions. David Reynolds stood slowly, adjusting his tie. His gaze sharpened as he stepped toward the stand. His footsteps were slow and deliberate. Officer Simmons, David began, you've stated that Miss Carter was aggressive and hostile from the moment you approached her. Is that correct? Yes, Simmons replied tersely. And you testified that she attempted to reach for your weapon? Yes. David's lips curled into a thin smile. Do you know how much a standard police issue holster weighs, Officer Simmons? Simmons frowned. What does that have to do with? Answer the question. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. About 2 pounds. David nodded. And the retention mechanism on a standard holster requires over 8 pounds of pressure to disengage, correct? Simmons hesitated. Yes. David's smile widened. So you expect the jury to believe that Miss Carter, who was standing over 3 feet away from you when the footage begins, crossed that distance, unhooked your retention holster, and attempted to remove your weapon, all in the span of approximately 1.3 seconds? Simmons's jaw tightened. It happened fast. David stepped closer to the stand, his gaze darkening. Or maybe it didn't happen at all. Simmons's face flushed. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. He held them up. These are reports from Officer Simmons' service record. Over the last 3 years, he has been accused of using excessive force on 7 separate occasions, all involving black defendants. None of those complaints were investigated internally. And why is that, Officer Simmons? Objection. Price shot to his feet. Irrelevant. Judge Blake narrowed his eyes. Overruled. Simmons's mouth tightened. I did my job. David's eyes gleamed coldly. You're very good at your job, Officer Simmons, especially when it comes to creating evidence that supports your version of events. Simmons's lips curled. Watch yourself. David smiled faintly. That sounds like a threat. Simmons's nostrils flared. David turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a clear pattern. Officer Simmons has a history of using excessive force, and his victims all have one thing in common. David's gaze sharpened as he turned toward Simmons. Would you like to tell the jury what that is? Simmons's mouth pressed into a hard line. David's voice dropped to a lethal calm. They were all black. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Simmons's hands gripped the sides of the stand. David took a breath. No further questions. As Simmons stepped down from the stand, he shot Olivia a hard glare, but his eyes were wide with barely concealed panic. Olivia met his gaze with a quiet smile. Price was already whispering furiously into Simmons's ear when Judge Blake called for the next witness. David stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Olivia Carter to the stand. Simmons's head whipped toward her. His face paled. David extended his hand toward Olivia. She stood, adjusting the front of her blazer. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stepped toward the stand. Judge Blake raised an eyebrow as Olivia was sworn in. David approached. Miss Carter, can you state your occupation for the court? Olivia's dark eyes flicked toward Simmons. Her lips curled faintly as she leaned toward the microphone. I work in law enforcement, she said calmly. David smiled. Could you clarify? Olivia's gaze sharpened. Her hand slid into the pocket of her blazer, and when she withdrew it, a small silver badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Malcolm Price stiffened. Simmons's eyes widened. My name is Olivia Carter, she said evenly, holding up the badge for everyone to see. Special Agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room froze. Price's mouth fell open. Judge Blake leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Excuse me. Olivia turned the badge toward the judge. I'm an undercover field agent for the FBI, assigned to monitor corruption within law enforcement. Her gaze sharpened as it met Simmons's. And my investigation just concluded. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Price shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is... Sit down, Mr. Price, Judge Blake snapped. Simmons's face was white. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. David smiled thinly. No further questions, Your Honor. Olivia stood, her expression cold and composed as she returned to her seat. Simmons's hand curled into a fist on the table. His chest rose and fell sharply as his jaw clenched. Careful, sweetheart, Simmons growled under his breath. Olivia's smile sharpened. You're the one who should be careful now. Judge Blake's gavel banged down. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Olivia stood and adjusted her blazer. David followed close behind her as they left the courtroom. That went well, David said. Olivia's smile widened. It's not over yet. The following morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras poised and ready. The tension in the air was electric. Everyone knew they were about to witness a reckoning. Derek Simmons sat at the prosecution's table, his face tight and pale. His confident smirk from the first day of trial had long since disappeared. Now, his hands were clasped together tightly, his jaw locked. Malcolm Price leaned toward him. "Don't panic. We can still spin this." Simmons's eyes darted toward Olivia Carter, seated calmly at the defense table. Her expression was composed, her dark eyes gleaming with quiet strength. "She played you," Price whispered, "but we'll handle it." Judge Blake entered the courtroom, and the room settled into tense silence. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. David Reynolds stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Special Agent Olivia Carter back to the stand." Malcolm Price shot to his feet. "Objection. On what grounds?" Judge Blake asked. "Relevance," Price said quickly. "This case is about obstruction of justice. Her role as an FBI agent changes nothing." Judge Blake's gaze sharpened. "Actually, it changes quite a bit, Mr. Price." "Overruled." Olivia stood and walked to the stand, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. When she sat down, David approached with his hands folded calmly in front of him. "Special Agent Carter," David said, emphasizing her title, "you stated yesterday that you were working undercover to investigate corruption within the local police department. Can you clarify what led you to this investigation?" Olivia's dark eyes flicked toward Simmons. "Several anonymous complaints were filed against Officer Simmons over the last 3 years, all alleging excessive force, falsified evidence, and racially motivated stops." Simmons's jaw tightened. David nodded. "And did you find those complaints credible?" "Yes," Olivia replied. "But they were all closed internally without investigation." David's expression sharpened. "Why?" "Because Officer Simmons had protection from inside the department," Olivia said calmly. "Certain high-ranking officials ensured that complaints against Simmons and his partner, Officer Mallory, never reached the disciplinary board." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. David's gaze darkened. "And how did you obtain this information?" Olivia smiled faintly. "I made friends." David's eyebrow lifted. "Friends?" Olivia turned toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. At that moment, they swung open, and 2 men in dark suits walked inside. One was African American, with a sharp, angular face and a badge clipped to his belt. The other was a white man in his 40s, carrying a thin file under his arm. "The defense would like to introduce 2 additional witnesses," David said smoothly. "Special Agent Marcus Keene and Special Agent John Harris of the Internal Affairs Division of the FBI." Simmons's face drained of color. The agents walked down the aisle and stood near the defense table. "Agent Keene," David said, "can you tell the court why you're here today?" Keene stepped forward. "We've been conducting a separate investigation into Officer Simmons and Officer Mallory for nearly 6 months, based on evidence obtained by Agent Carter during her undercover operation." David's gaze sharpened. "And what did you find?" Keene pulled out the thin file and handed it to David. Multiple falsified arrest reports, altered body cam footage, and most notably, financial transactions linking Simmons and Mallory to known drug traffickers. A stunned silence spread through the room. David opened the file and held it up for the jury to see. So, not only were Officers Simmons and Mallory engaging in excessive force, they were being paid to protect certain criminal operations? "Yes," Keene said. "Objection," Price shouted. "Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial." "Overruled," Judge Blake snapped. Simmons's fists clenched on the table. His face was red, his chest rising and falling rapidly. David stepped toward Olivia. "Special Agent Carter, were you aware that Officer Simmons was involved in criminal activity when you confronted him on the night in question?" "Not entirely," Olivia replied, "but I suspected it when he attempted to arrest me without cause." David smiled thinly. "So Officer Simmons not only used excessive force, he was attempting to silence you because he realized who you were?" Olivia's gaze sharpened. "Exactly." David turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. Now you have hard evidence that Officer Simmons wasn't just enforcing the law. He was exploiting it. He framed Special Agent Carter to protect himself." Malcolm Price stood. This is outrageous. Sit down, Mr. Price. Judge Blake's tone was ice cold. David's gaze hardened as he turned towards Simmons. Officer Simmons, would you like to explain the large deposits made to your account over the last 2 years? Simmons's mouth twisted. I want my lawyer. David smiled thinly. That's the first smart thing you've said today. Judge Blake's gavel struck the bench. We will recess for 20 minutes. When we return, I expect answers. As the room emptied, Simmons stormed toward Olivia. You think you've won? He hissed. You don't know how this works. Olivia's gaze was cold. I know exactly how this works. That's why I'm sitting over here, and you're over there. Simmons's jaw twitched. You're going to regret this. Olivia smiled faintly. No, Derek, you're the one who's going to regret this. David approached as Simmons stalked away. He's breaking, David said. He's already broken, Olivia replied calmly. He just hasn't realized it yet. David nodded. Think the jury's paying attention? They're not just paying attention, Olivia said, watching Simmons's retreating back. They're waiting for the final blow. 20 minutes later, the courtroom was packed once again. The tension was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Olivia Carter sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression remained calm and steady, but her dark eyes were sharp as they followed Derek Simmons' every move. Simmons sat at the prosecution's table, his face pale and tight. His lawyer, Malcolm Price, leaned toward him, speaking in hushed tones, but Simmons's gaze was locked on Olivia. His jaw twitched, his fists clenched. Judge Blake entered the room, adjusting his robe as he settled into his seat. His gaze swept across the room, his eyes hard behind his glasses. Court is now back in session, the bailiff announced. David Reynolds stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to recall Officer Simmons to the stand. Malcolm Price shot to his feet. Objection. On what grounds? Judge Blake asked. Price hesitated. Relevance. Judge Blake's gaze sharpened. Overruled. Officer Simmons, take the stand. Simmons's jaw twitched, but he stood stiffly and walked to the stand, his movements sharp and angry. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and stared straight ahead, refusing to look at Olivia. David approached the stand with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze was cold. Officer Simmons, David began, let's go over the events of June 12th one more time. Simmons's nostrils flared. I've already testified. Yes, David interrupted smoothly. And you testified that Miss Carter was resisting arrest and attempting to reach for your weapon, correct? Yes. David's eyes narrowed. And you testified that your body cam malfunctioned? Yes. David smiled faintly. Would you like to explain this, then? He walked to the defense table and picked up a thin silver USB drive. Malcolm Price sat up straighter. Objection. On what grounds? Judge Blake asked. Price's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David inserted the drive into the media console. The large screen above the jury flickered to life. This, David said calmly, is Officer Mallory's body cam footage. Simmons's face drained of color. The video began. The sound of footsteps and radio chatter filled the room. The image showed Simmons approaching Olivia on the sidewalk. His hand was already resting on his holster. Simmons's voice, ID. Now, Olivia's voice, I haven't done anything wrong. Simmons, I said give me your damn ID. The video showed Simmons stepping toward Olivia. She took a step back, hands raised. Olivia, you're being aggressive. Simmons, cutting her off. You need to learn to respect authority. Then came the critical moment. Simmons reached for Olivia's arm, but Olivia didn't resist. She stepped back. Simmons shoved her against the side of the patrol car. Simmons, now you're resisting? That's assault. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the video. David smiled thinly. Would you like to explain that, Officer Simmons? Simmons's face flushed deep red. That video is authentic? David cut in. Yes, it's been verified by FBI forensic analysts. Unlike your earlier testimony. Simmons's mouth twisted. David stepped closer. You lied under oath. You falsified reports. And when Agent Carter didn't play along, you tried to frame her for assault. Simmons's hands clenched the edge of the stand. I was doing my job. David's eyes darkened. No, you were abusing your badge. Simmons's mouth twisted, his breathing sharp and ragged. You don't understand how this works. David leaned forward. No, Simmons, you don't understand how this works. Judge Blake's gavel struck the bench. Enough. David straightened. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Blake turned toward Simmons. His gaze was cold. Officer Simmons, do you have anything to say in your defense? Simmons opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was flushed with humiliation. Judge Blake's gaze hardened. Then sit down. Simmons stumbled down from the stand, his head bowed. He sat heavily at the prosecution table, his hands gripping the sides of his chair. Judge Blake turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence. You've seen the video. I am prepared to render a ruling. The courtroom tensed. Simmons's mouth twisted. Judge Blake adjusted his glasses. Derek Simmons, you are hereby found guilty of perjury, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice. Gasps filled the room. Simmons's eyes widened. What? Judge Blake's gavel struck the bench. You will be remanded into custody immediately pending a formal sentencing hearing. Officer Mallory will also be placed under immediate investigation by the FBI. Two bailiffs approached Simmons. He rose to his feet, his face red with rage. You can't do this, Simmons shouted. I'm a decorated officer, and now you're a convicted felon, Judge Blake said coldly. Take him away. The bailiffs seized Simmons by the arms. He thrashed violently. This isn't over, he screamed. You don't know what you're doing. Olivia's gaze was cold as Simmons was dragged away. Simmons's eyes locked with hers one last time. You're going to regret this. Olivia smiled faintly. I already told you, Simmons. Simmons's face twisted in rage. I don't regret anything. As Simmons disappeared through the side door, the room fell into stunned silence. Olivia stood, adjusting her blazer. David leaned toward her. Well played. Olivia's smile sharpened. Thanks. Judge Blake addressed the jury. Court is adjourned. As the crowd filtered out of the courtroom, Olivia felt a subtle sense of relief settle over her chest. David glanced toward her. Drinks? Olivia smiled. Not yet. We still have to clean up the mess Simmons left behind. David grinned. I have a feeling you'll handle that just fine. Olivia's gaze darkened. Oh, you have no idea. The air outside the courthouse was thick with humidity, but the sharp sunlight felt crisp and cutting. Olivia Carter stepped down the marble steps with measured grace. The crowd that had gathered along the sidewalk erupted into a storm of noise the moment they saw her. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust toward her face. Camera shutters clicked wildly. The hum of voices, some excited, some angry, filled the air. Agent Carter! Agent Carter! Did you know Simmons was corrupt before you confronted him? How does it feel to bring down one of the department's top officers? Do you think the police department can recover from this scandal? Olivia's dark eyes narrowed as she raised her hand. No comment. David Reynolds fell in his step beside her, his hands in his pockets. How does it feel? Like it's not over yet, Olivia replied. David smirked. Even after Simmons got hauled out of the courtroom like a drunk at a bar fight, Olivia's lips curled into a faint smile. Simmons was just a symptom. David's gaze sharpened. And you're going after the disease. Exactly. Special Agent Marcus Keene and Special Agent John Harris emerged from the courthouse behind them, their suits crisp under the harsh sunlight. Agent Carter, Keene called, stepping toward her. Olivia turned. Internal Affairs is already working with the Department of Justice to review every case Simmons and Mallory touched in the last 5 years, Keene said. Preliminary reports suggest at least 40 convictions tied to falsified evidence. David whistled under his breath. That's going to be one hell of a cleanup. Keene's jaw tightened. That's just the beginning. Olivia's expression remained calm, but her gaze sharpened. And Mallory? Suspended without pay, Keene said. Her hearing is next week. But based on the evidence we gathered, she's looking at criminal charges for obstruction and conspiracy. David shook his head. 2 decorated officers turned criminals. Not criminals, Olivia corrected. Predators. A reporter pushed closer, nearly shoving a microphone into Olivia's face. Agent Carter, do you think Simmons acted alone? Olivia's eyes darkened. No. The crowd quieted. David's gaze flicked toward her. Are you sure you want to go there? I'm already there, Olivia replied coldly. The tension rippled through the gathering like an electric current. Marcus Keene's brow furrowed. If Simmons wasn't acting alone, Olivia's gaze was like steel. He wasn't. Keene's mouth tightened. Then who? Olivia's jaw set. That's the next phase. David's expression hardened. You think someone higher up was protecting them? Olivia's gaze sharpened. I don't think I know. Keene's eyes narrowed. Do you have proof? Olivia's smile was faint. Not yet. Then what's the next move? Olivia's eyes gleamed. Pressure. David chuckled. I'd hate to be on the other end of that. Someone will be, Olivia said darkly. David leaned closer. What's your play, Olivia? Olivia's gaze sharpened. Expose the network. David's eyes widened slightly. That's a dangerous game. Good thing I'm good at it, Olivia said with a faint smile. Just then, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. A driver in a dark suit stepped out and opened the back door. Marcus Keene extended his hand. Agent Carter, we'll keep you posted. Olivia shook his hand firmly. Keep the pressure on. We will. Keene nodded toward the SUV. Need a ride? Olivia smiled faintly. I'll walk. David chuckled. You really do like making a statement, don't you? Olivia's smile widened. Sometimes the quietest steps make the loudest impact. David watched her as she turned and started walking down the sidewalk. The crowd parted as she moved through it, her presence commanding without saying a word. A young black woman standing near the courthouse steps caught Olivia's attention. The woman's eyes were wide, her hand pressed over her mouth. Olivia stopped. The woman stepped forward. Agent Carter, thank you. Olivia's smile softened. Don't thank me yet. But you stood up to them. You showed them that they can't get away with it anymore. Olivia's gaze darkened. We're not done yet. David stepped closer. You gonna make that your new motto? Olivia's eyes gleamed. No. David smiled. Then what? Olivia's gaze lifted toward the sky, her posture straight, her voice calm and sharp. No badge should ever grant immunity from justice. David's smile widened. Catchy. Olivia's eyes darkened. It's not catchy, it's a warning. 1 week later, the footage of Simmons being dragged out of the courtroom had gone viral. News segments dissected the case for days, exposing how Simmons and Mallory had manipulated evidence and terrorized the local community. Public outcry grew. Activists called for widespread reform within the police department. Local officials scrambled to contain the damage. Simmons's criminal trial was already being scheduled. Federal charges were likely to follow. Mallory's hearing was set for the following week. Internal Affairs had reopened over 40 closed cases involving Simmons and Mallory. Early reports suggested that several convictions would be overturned. David sat across from Olivia in a quiet corner of a local cafe. Olivia's coffee sat untouched in front of her. You've created a storm, David said with a smile. Olivia's gaze sharpened. Good. And what's next? Olivia leaned forward. Simmons and Mallory were protected. Someone higher up knew what they were doing and let it happen. David's eyes darkened. You're going after them. Yes. David's smile faded. And if they come after you? Olivia's gaze didn't waver. They already tried. David chuckled. You're dangerous. Olivia's lips curled into a faint smile. That's why they're afraid.